telegram arrived at Middle East headquarters in Cairo on the 8th of August 1942. Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of the largest British theatre of operations in the world, opened it in his Spartan office. 3 weeks earlier he had personally stopped Erwin Rommel at the gates of Egypt. His exhausted army, outnumbered, outgunned, and retreating for 400 miles, had turned and fought the most important defensive battle of the Desert War. Rommel had been halted 60 miles from Alexandria. Cairo had been saved. The Suez Canal remained in British hands. The telegram informed Auchinleck that he was being relieved of command, not for losing, for winning in a way that embarrassed the wrong people, for refusing to launch an offensive before his army was ready, for being right when Churchill needed him to be fast, to understand how the best desert general Britain produced was rewarded with a sacking, while his replacement took the credit for a victory that was already won. You have to understand the politics of command in 1942, and you have to understand a man who came from the wrong army, knew the wrong people, and made the fatal mistake of putting military judgment ahead of political convenience. His name was Claude Auchinleck. The troops called him the Auk, and this is the story the official histories would rather you forget. Auchinleck was born on the 21st of June, 1884, in Aldershot, the garrison town that served as the headquarters of the British Army. His father was a colonel in the Royal Horse Artillery, who died when Claude was 8 years old, leaving the family in what the Victorians politely called reduced circumstances. His mother raised him on a widow's pension. There was no family money, no landed estate, no network of influential relatives. He attended Wellington College on a scholarship and entered Sandhurst in 1902. When the final rankings were published, Auchinleck was placed last on the list of candidates allocated to the Indian Army. The man who had become one of only 5 field marshals produced by that army in its entire history began his career at the bottom of his intake. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to Auchinleck. The Indian Army assignment was not a choice. It was what remained after the better connected candidates had taken the prestige positions in British regiments, but it shaped everything that followed. The Indian Army was a separate institution from the British Army, with its own traditions, its own promotion tracks, and its own officer corps. British officers who served in India rarely transferred back. The two armies had almost no contact with each other. As the historian Raymond Callaghan put it, many British regulars regarded the Indian Army and its officers as second-rate. This institutional snobbery would haunt Auchinleck for the rest of his career. He was commissioned into the 62nd Punjabis in April 1904 and spent the next 3 decades learning his trade on the northwest frontier. He fought against the Mahsuds and the Wazirs in the mountains of what is now Pakistan. He served in the catastrophic Mesopotamia campaign of 1916 and 17, where his regiment suffered nearly 50% casualties in a single month. He learnt the hard way that soldiers need rest, food, medical care, and adequate supplies before they can fight effectively. He saw what happened when commanders launched poorly prepared attacks against well-armed defenders dug into strong positions. These lessons would put him on a collision course with Winston Churchill. By the outbreak of war in 1939, Auchinleck was a major general commanding the Peshawar district. His reputation within the Indian Army was exceptional. He spoke multiple Indian languages fluently. His soldiers, whatever their background, would follow him anywhere. When the Chatfield Committee was tasked with modernising the Indian Army for modern war, Auchinleck led the effort. The army he helped rebuild would grow from 183,000 men in 1939 to over 2.25 million by 1945, the largest volunteer army in human history. In April 1940, with the war in Europe turning desperate, Auchinleck was summoned to command the 4th Corps in England. It was the only time in the entire war that a wholly British corps was commanded by an Indian Army officer. He was immediately sent to Norway as senior commander of Allied land and air forces. Allied troops took Narvik on the 28th of May 1940. Though Auchinleck then had to oversee the evacuation as the campaign was abandoned. Churchill noticed him then. Mutual confidence grew, Churchill would later write. It would not last. Churchill appointed Auchinleck Commander-in-Chief Middle East in July 1941, swapping him with the exhausted Wavell. The political pressure was immediate and unrelenting. Churchill wanted an offensive to relieve Tobruk. Auchinleck wanted to wait until mid-November, when a railway and fuel pipeline to the frontier would be completed. Churchill summoned him to London to pressure him personally. Auchinleck refused to be moved. The offensive, codenamed Crusader, would launch when it was ready and not before. Here was the fundamental clash that would define everything that followed. Auchinleck believed that military operations should be governed by military reality. Churchill believed that political necessity trumped tactical caution. Neither man was entirely wrong, but in 1942, with Britain's prestige collapsing across the globe, Churchill's patience had limits. Operation Crusader launched on the 18th of November 1941 with approximately 118,000 men and roughly 740 tanks against Rommel's approximately 400 tanks and 7 Italian divisions. Within 4 days, the situation was desperate. British armoured units scattered across multiple engagements at Bir el Gubi, Gabr Saleh and Sidi Rezeg had lost 530 tanks against roughly 100 Axis losses. On the 23rd of November, a day the soldiers called Black Sunday, Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham, commanding the 8th Army, wanted to halt the offensive and withdraw. What happened next showed Auchinleck at his best. He flew forward to Cunningham's headquarters and personally ordered the offensive to continue. On the 25th of November, he handed Cunningham written orders containing the sentence, "There is only one order, attack and pursue." The next day he relieved Cunningham and replaced him with Major General Neil Ritchie. And then it got worse. The Ritchie appointment was Auchinleck's first serious mistake. As Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke later wrote, "Nobody in his senses would have sent Ritchie to succeed Cunningham. Ritchie had not the experience or qualifications for the job. Auchinleck chose him anyway, trusting that he could direct operations from Cairo while Ritchie handled day-to-day command. It was a fatal misjudgment about his own ability to run a battle by remote control. Crusader succeeded despite everything. Tobruk was relieved on the 4th of December. Rommel withdrew to El Agheila by mid-January 1942, losing approximately 38,000 casualties, including 29,900 prisoners. But the seeds of future disaster had been planted. The Gazala catastrophe of May and June 1942 was not Auchinleck's battle to fight in detail, but it was his responsibility. Ritchie's 8th Army held a line of brigade-strength defensive positions stretching 43 miles south from the coast, behind vast minefields. The critical weakness was that these boxes were too far apart to support each other, and the infantry, artillery and armour operated separately rather than as combined formations. It was a recipe for disaster against a commander as aggressive and opportunistic as Rommel. Rommel attacked on the 26th of May with 560 tanks against Ritchie's 849, sweeping around the southern flank in a wide flanking movement that bypassed the minefields entirely. The British should have had the advantage. They outnumbered Rommel in armour, in artillery, and in men. They had better supply lines. They knew Rommel was coming, and yet everything that could go wrong did go wrong. By the 29th of May, after heavy losses and critically low fuel, Rommel withdrew into a defensive position against the British minefields. His situation was desperate. His tanks were running on fumes. His supply columns had been cut. For 72 hours, the Afrika Korps sat in what the soldiers called the cauldron, vulnerable to counterattack. It was the moment that could have ended the Desert War. Ritchie failed to strike. The 150th Infantry Brigade, isolated in the cauldron and threatening Rommel's supply route, held out for 72 hours without any support from the rest of 8th Army. They fought magnificently. They requested relief. None came. On the 1st of June they were destroyed. 3,000 men, 90 tanks and 100 guns captured. The brigade simply ceased to exist. Ritchie's belated counterattack on the 5th of June, Operation Aberdeen, was a catastrophe that revealed everything wrong with British tactical doctrine in the desert. The 32nd Army Tank Brigade lost 50 of 70 tanks. The 22nd Armoured Brigade lost 60 of 156. Infantry went in without armour support. Armour went in without infantry support. Artillery fired on empty desert while the real battle raged elsewhere. Unit after unit was fed into the battle piecemeal and destroyed piecemeal. By the 13th of June, what the soldiers called Black Saturday, the 8th Army's armour had been reduced from 250 cruiser and 80 infantry tanks to just 50 cruiser and 30 infantry tanks. Auchinleck authorised abandonment of the Gazala line on the 14th of June. Then came the ultimate humiliation. Tobruk fell on the 21st of June in a single day. The fortress that had held out for 8 months under siege in 1941, that had become a symbol of British resistance in the desert, collapsed in 24 hours. Major General Klopper surrendered approximately 33,000 troops, 2,000 vehicles, and 5,000 tons of rations. It was the second largest British capitulation of the war after Singapore. The speed of the collapse shocked everyone. Tobruk's defences had been allowed to deteriorate during the months when it was behind British lines. The minefields were incomplete. The anti-tank ditches had filled with sand. The garrison, a mix of South African, British and Indian troops, had not been given time to familiarise themselves with the position. Rommel attacked at dawn on the 20th of June. By the evening of the 21st, it was over. Churchill was visiting Roosevelt in Washington when he received the news. He was handed the telegram in the Oval Office. "This was one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war," he wrote. Not only were its military effects grievous, but it had affected the reputation of the British armies. He told Roosevelt, "I am the most miserable Englishman in America since Burgoyne." The comparison was apt. Burgoyne had surrendered an entire army at Saratoga. Now, for the second time in 4 months, a British general had surrendered an entire garrison. Roosevelt's response was immediate and generous. Without being asked, he offered to send American equipment to replace what had been lost. 300 Sherman tanks, 100 M7 Priest self-propelled guns, and 150 instructors were dispatched to the Middle East. These weapons, the finest armor America could produce, would arrive in time for the next battle, but they would not arrive in time to save Auchinleck. This is the part the official histories gloss over. On the 25th of June 1942, Auchinleck flew to Ritchie's headquarters at Mercer Matruh, relieved him, and took personal command of the 8th Army. He took Major General Eric Dorman Smith as his battlefield advisor. His signal to the troops struck exactly the right note. The enemy hopes to take Egypt by bluff. Show him where he gets off. He chose to make his stand not at Matruh but 100 miles further east at El Alamein, where a 40-mile bottleneck between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression negated Rommel's ability to outflank. If Rommel was going to take Cairo, he would have to go through the 8th Army, not around it. Cairo was in panic. On what the British called Ash Wednesday, the 1st of July, headquarters staff burnt confidential papers in their gardens and courtyards. Half-charred sheets floated down onto city streets. Smoke rose from a dozen bonfires across the city. The Mediterranean fleet pulled out of Alexandria, steaming for Haifa and Port Said to avoid being trapped. Italian families hung out Axis bunting in anticipation of liberation. Egyptian nationalists whispered that Rommel would be welcomed as a liberator. Mussolini flew to Libya for his expected triumphant entry into the Egyptian capital, bringing with him a white horse on which he intended to parade through Cairo's streets. Rommel attacked on the 1st of July 1942 with perhaps 55 to 70 operational tanks. His troops were exhausted. His 3 German divisions numbered just 1,200 to 1,500 men each, a fraction of their establishment strength. The 90th Light Division, which should have fielded over 10,000 men, could muster barely 2,000. Rommel was gambling everything on one last push. The first day nearly succeeded. The 18th Indian Infantry Brigade, newly arrived from Iraq and unfamiliar with desert warfare, was posted at Deir el-Shein, directly in Rommel's path. They held all day. They were not supposed to. They were supposed to delay for a few hours while stronger forces consolidated behind them. Instead, they fought until they were overrun, buying the time that saved Egypt. When the position finally fell that evening, the Afrika Korps had only 37 tanks left. The brigade had ceased to exist, but so had Rommel's momentum. The 2nd of July saw confused fighting across the entire front. Rommel pushed toward the Ruwaysat Ridge, the key terrain feature dominating the centre of the line. Auchinleck fed in reinforcements as they arrived. The 1st Armoured Division counter-attacked. Neither side gained decisive advantage. By evening, the Afrika Korps had 30 tanks operational. On the 3rd of July, Rommel tried again. The RAF flew 780 sorties, hammering every Axis concentration they could find. By evening, the Afrika Korps had 26 tanks. 26 tanks to take Egypt. The Italian Ariete Division, which had started with 163 tanks, was reduced to 5 after a devastating attack by the 2nd New Zealand Division. This is where the numbers stop making sense from an attacker's perspective. Rommel had nothing left. His infantry divisions were at 10% strength. His armour was reduced to a handful of vehicles. His supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles through contested desert, and yet he kept attacking, because stopping meant admitting defeat. The numbers tell the rest of the story. Auchinleck then launched a series of counteroffensives that broke the back of Rommel's army. This is where his generalship truly shone. He did not simply defend, he attacked, repeatedly, at the points where Rommel was weakest. At Tel el-Ezer on the 10th of July, Australian troops of the 9th Division attacked along the coastal sector. They captured 1,500 prisoners in a single day. More critically, they overran German Intelligence Unit Company 621, the signals interception team that had been reading British communications throughout the campaign. The Australians captured documents, code books, and equipment. Rommel was suddenly blind. His greatest intelligence advantage, the ability to read British intentions before they acted, was gone. The Ruwaysat Ridge battles between the 14th and 23rd of July were Auchinleck's masterstroke. He had learnt, through bitter experience and through ultra-intelligence, that Italian formations were the weak link in Rommel's line. The Germans could not hold the entire front. They depended on Italian divisions to hold the quieter sectors, while German units concentrated at the point of decision. Auchinleck decided to attack the Italians directly. His explicit policy was to hit the Italians wherever possible in view of their low morale, and because the Germans cannot hold extended fronts without them. It was controversial then, and remains controversial now. Some historians have called it callous, even racist, but it was also devastatingly effective. When the New Zealanders and Indians attacked Italian positions on the Rewrote Ridge, those positions collapsed. Rommel was forced to commit his precious German reserves to plug the gaps, wearing down the forces he needed for offensive operations. The fighting was brutal. The 4th New Zealand Brigade suffered over 700 casualties at Rewrote on the 15th of July. The 5th Indian Infantry Brigade was nearly destroyed. But each attack, even the failed ones, cost Rommel irreplaceable men and equipment. Each attack forced him to react rather than act. Each attack pushed him further from the initiative he needed to win. By the 31st of July, when Auchinleck called off operations, Rommel's forces had lost approximately 70% of their manpower, 85% of armour, 65% of anti-tank weapons, and 50% of heavy anti-aircraft guns. Total Allied casualties were approximately 13,250. Axis losses were approximately 17,000, including 7,000 prisoners. Mussolini flew home without his triumph. Rommel never reached Alexandria. He never reached Cairo. He never reached the Suez Canal. The First Battle of El Alamein had halted the Axis advance and saved Egypt. It was fought and won before Montgomery left Britain. Churchill arrived in Cairo on the 4th of August 1942. He brought with him the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke, his personal physician, Lord Moran, and Colonel Ian Jacob. Field Marshal Smuts flew in from South Africa. The political context was crushing. Churchill had survived a vote of no confidence on the 2nd of July by 475 to 25. But his position was weaker than those numbers suggested. Singapore had fallen in February with 85,000 men surrendering. Tobruk had fallen in June. Stalin was demanding a second front. Operation Torch, the American landings in French North Africa, was scheduled for November. Churchill desperately needed a British victory before the Americans entered the Mediterranean theatre. The visit to Auchinleck's forward headquarters on the 5th of August was not encouraging to Churchill. He described it with immortal distaste. We were given breakfast in a wire-netted cube full of flies and important military personages. When pressed on when he would attack, Auchinleck said mid-September at the earliest. Churchill wanted immediate action. Here's where the decision becomes indefensible. Brooke's diary entries reveal the establishment's verdict. On the atmosphere at Auchinleck's headquarters, he wrote that the Auk had completely lost confidence in himself. Everyone was always looking over their shoulders towards prepared positions to which to retreat. This was a strange assessment of a commander who had just fought a 27-day defensive battle that saved Egypt. But Brooke had made up his mind. On Auchinleck's key advisor Eric Dorman-Smith, the hostility was even sharper. The Dorman-Smith influence on Auchinleck was far too strong. Colonel Jacob was blunter. Everyone regards Dorman-Smith as a menace of the First Order. The decision crystallised on the 6th of August. Auchinleck would go. Churchill initially offered command to Brooke himself, with Montgomery as 8th Army commander. Brooke declined, reasoning he could better serve as CEGS, restraining Churchill's more impulsive ideas. Lieutenant General William Gott, known as Strafer, was then chosen for 8th Army over Brooke's strong advocacy for Montgomery. On the 7th of August, Luftwaffe fighters shot down Gott's slow Bristol-Bombay transport aircraft, killing the most senior British soldier lost to enemy fire in the entire war. Montgomery got the job by accident of death. Lord Moran watched Brooke break the news to Auchinleck on the embassy lawn. I could not hear what the CIGS was saying, nor could I see the expression on Auchinleck's face, but I did not need any help to follow what was happening. Auchinleck sat with his forearms resting on his thighs, his hands drooping down between his knees, his head drooping forward like a flower on a broken stalk. Colonel Jacob, who delivered the formal letter, said he felt as if I was going to murder an unsuspecting friend. Churchill later told Harold Nicholson, "It was a terrible thing to have to do. He took it like a gentleman, but it was a terrible thing. It is difficult to remove a bad general at the height of a campaign. It is atrocious to remove a good general." He described it elsewhere as being like killing a magnificent stag. Auchinleck was offered the newly created Persia and Iraq command, a transparent demotion. He refused it, arguing the arrangement was unworkable. He returned to India, spending almost a year unemployed. A full general without a command in the middle of a world war. Montgomery arrived in Cairo on the 12th of August and took over the Eighth Army within days, though sources differ on whether the formal handover occurred on the 13th or the 15th. In a characteristically bold move, he began issuing orders before the official transfer was complete. His speech to officers was a masterpiece of command rhetoric. "Here we will stand and fight. There will be no further withdrawal. I have ordered that all plans and instructions dealing with further withdrawal are to be burnt and at once. We will stand and fight here. If we can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead." It was magnificent theatre. It was also, in operational terms, completely irrelevant. Auchinleck had already chosen to stand at El Alamein. He had already fought a 27-day battle to hold it. The retreat plans Montgomery ordered burnt were contingency reconnaissances of the kind any competent commander maintains, but the speech worked. Both Brooke and Alexander were astonished by the transformation in atmosphere within a week. I think what Montgomery inherited is the most under-examined aspect of this entire story. The Dorman-Smith appreciation of the situation in the Western Desert, dated the 27th of July 1942, specifically predicted that Rommel would attack through the southern sector toward the Alam Halfa Ridge and recommended its defence as critical. When Rommel duly attacked on the 31st of August, the Battle of Alam Halfa was fought on what multiple historians confirm was a plan very close to that conceived by Dorman-Smith for Auchinleck. Montgomery made one important modification, bringing forward the 44th Division from the Delta to form a continuous defensive line. But the basic concept was inherited. Montgomery never admitted this. The material transformation was even more decisive. The 300 Sherman tanks promised by Roosevelt began arriving in Egypt in early September and would be battle-ready by October. The 51st Highland Division and 44th Home Counties Division were arriving from Britain. New 6-pounder anti-tank guns were replacing the useless 2-pounders. Spitfires were reinforcing the Desert Air Force. The intelligence picture was clearer than ever. Rommel's own intelligence source, the broken American diplomatic code used by Colonel Bonner Fellers in Cairo, had been discovered and shut down in June, before Montgomery arrived. By the 23rd of October, when the Second Battle of El Alamein opened, Montgomery commanded 195,000 men, 1,029 tanks including 252 Shermans, over 900 artillery pieces, 1,400 anti-tank guns, and approximately 750 aircraft with complete air superiority. Rommel had 116,000 men and 547 tanks, more than half of them inferior Italian models. Axis supply ships were being sunk at devastating rates, 7 out of 30 in August alone. Fuel reserves allowed only limited tank mobility. Montgomery enjoyed roughly 2-to-1 superiority in every category, with qualitative dominance in the Sherman. Rommel was not even present when the battle began. He was on sick leave in Austria, and only returned on the evening of the 25th of October. The battle opened at 21:40 hours on the 23rd of October, with a 600-gun barrage, the heaviest since 1918. Operation Lightfoot sent infantry and engineers through 5 miles of minefields. It did not go according to Montgomery's master plan. The offensive bogged down repeatedly, requiring Montgomery to shift his main thrust multiple times. Operation Supercharge, the final breakthrough, was launched on the night of the 1st and 2nd of November. By the battle's end, Allied casualties were approximately 13,500 killed and wounded. Axis losses reached 37,000 total, with 30,000 prisoners. It was a decisive victory. It was also, in the assessment of the historian Corelli Barnett, a battle won with overwhelming material superiority against a crippled opponent whose supply lines were already severed. The great irony cuts deep. Auchinleck was sacked for requesting 6 weeks to prepare an offensive. Montgomery took 12 weeks, twice as long, and launched on the 23rd of October, more than a month later than Auchinleck's mid-September target. But Montgomery had Brooke protecting his back, and Churchill's desperate need for a victory before Torch made replacing him unthinkable. Montgomery's treatment of Auchinleck's legacy was by any fair assessment shameful. In his 1958 memoirs, Montgomery claimed that on meeting Auchinleck he was told the Eighth Army would fall back on the Delta if Rommel attacked, with another possibility being a withdrawal to Palestine. He wrote, "I listened in amazement to his exposition of his plans. This was a fabrication. Multiple historians have demonstrated there is no evidence that Auchinleck intended to abandon the strong defensive position that he had already established at El Alamein. The claim was so egregious that Auchinleck threatened a libel action. Montgomery was forced to issue a radio broadcast on the 20th of November, 1958, addressing the controversy, and the 1960 paperback edition of his memoirs carried a publisher's note acknowledging the dispute. Churchill had already settled out of court in 1954 after Dorman Smith sued over similar claims in The Hinge of Fate, Churchill's war memoirs. Some Montgomery supporters went further. Charles Richardson, a senior 8th Army staff officer, stated publicly that no battle entitled to the name First Alamein ever took place. This attempt to deny the existence of the July 1942 battle as a distinct engagement, thereby erasing Auchinleck's greatest achievement, reveals the systematic nature of the reputational campaign. Montgomery's biographer Nigel Hamilton reinforced this narrative across 3 volumes, committing what reviewers called character assassination on Auchinleck. Hamilton's father, Sir Dennis Hamilton, was Montgomery's friend and literary advisor, a clear conflict of interest. Hamilton called Auchinleck incompetent and dismissed pro-Auchinleck scholarship as unsubstantiated quackery. Even Eisenhower, after reading Montgomery's memoirs, reportedly never spoke to him again, calling him an egocentric and a psychopath. Against this machine, Auchinleck deployed the most devastating weapon in his arsenal: silence. His biographer Philip Warner recorded that he steadfastly and honourably refused to be drawn into discussing or criticising the roles of others, such as Churchill, Montgomery, or Mountbatten, even when his own reputation suffered. He always argued that history would be his judge. At a function in the 1950s, when Churchill approached him and acknowledged he had wronged him, Auchinleck simply said, "I know, Prime Minister." The revisionist case for Auchinleck began with John Connell's biography in 1959 and Corelli Barnett's The Desert Generals in 1960. Barnett called Auchinleck the victor of Alamein and described Montgomery in terms I probably shouldn't repeat on this channel. Philip Warner's Auchinleck, The Lonely Soldier, published in 1981, provided the most balanced assessment, arguing he was the first British general to defeat the Germans, and that his downfall probably owed to Churchill's inability to understand a man of the Auk's basic integrity. The American military historian David Zabecki noted that the Germans tend to give Auchinleck the credit for stopping Rommel, seeing Second Alamein as merely the last in a logical chain of events that began at First Alamein. Anthony Beevor has taken the notable position that the reputations of Bernard Montgomery and Erwin Rommel are far overblown. Brooks' verdict, characteristically precise, captures both the tragedy and its cause. Auchinleck, to my mind, had most of the qualifications to make him one of the finest of commanders, but unfortunately he lacked the most important of all, the ability to select the men to serve him. This is fair as far as it goes. The appointments of Ritchie and Corbett were indefensible. But it elides the deeper truth that Auchinleck's poor picking was partly a function of his outsider status in the British Army's networks of patronage. He did not know the right people because he had spent his career with the wrong army. And if this sounds familiar, if you've watched someone get the top job because they went to the right school or knew the right people while the person who actually delivered results got nothing, you're not imagining it. The British Army in 1942 ran on the same principles as every other British institution of the era: the right regiment, the right accent, the right dinner party. Auchinleck didn't have any of those things. He had results, and results in the end were not enough. Auchinleck returned to India as Commander-in-Chief in June 1943. It was, in many ways, a return home. He had spent his entire career with the Indian Army. He understood its traditions, its strengths, its peculiarities. And now, in the darkest days of the Burma campaign, that army needed him. What Auchinleck did in India between 1943 and 1947 deserves far more attention than it typically receives. He rebuilt the Indian Army after the disasters of 1942. He created the training establishments, the logistical systems, and the administrative machinery that made victory in Burma possible. He backed William Slim when others wanted him removed. He fought Whitehall for resources that London wanted to send elsewhere. William Slim, who would go on to win the greatest British land campaign of the war in Burma, later testified that the 14th Army, from its birth to its final victory, owed much to his unselfish support and never-failing understanding. Without him, and what he and the Army of India did for us, we could not have existed, let alone conquered. This was not mere politeness. Slim was not given to false praise. He meant every word. The scale of what Auchinleck built is staggering. By 1945, the Indian Army numbered over 2.5 million men, the largest volunteer army in human history. It fought in North Africa, in East Africa, in Italy, in Burma, in Malaya. Indian divisions served with distinction on every front where British forces fought, and the man who built that army, who trained it, who equipped it, who sent it into battle, was Claude Auchinleck. He was promoted to Field Marshal on the 1st of June 1946, but refused a peerage, lest he be associated with partition, which he thought fundamentally dishonourable. He had spent 44 years serving alongside Indian soldiers. He spoke their languages. He knew their traditions. He had led them in battle and mourned their dead. The idea of presiding over the division of the subcontinent, of watching the army he loved torn apart along religious lines, was more than he could bear. Montgomery, as CIGS, undermined him from London with characteristic generosity. Auchinleck's usefulness in India has finished. He is 63. He has spent all his life in India under a previous regime. He is too old to readjust himself to new ideas. This from the man who had inherited Auchinleck's position, Auchinleck's army, Auchinleck's plan, and Auchinleck's victory. After partition, after the dissolution of the army he had loved for 44 years, Auchinleck lived quietly in London and Suffolk. His wife Jessie had left him in 1946 for Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Pearse. The man who had commanded armies and shaped the fate of nations found himself alone in a modest English house, with nothing but his memories and his silence. He never wrote his memoirs. He never gave interviews attacking his critics. He never sought to set the record straight in public. When historians came calling, he answered their questions with scrupulous honesty, but refused to criticise Churchill, Montgomery, or anyone else who had wronged him. He lived on his pension and his principles. At 84, he emigrated to Marrakesh in Morocco, where he lived alone in a modest flat on the avenue Mohammed V. He took morning coffee at La Renaissance Café, reading the newspapers and watching the world go by. The locals knew him simply as Le Marshal, the old soldier who lived alone and spoke of nothing but the weather. He never returned to India. He never saw the army he had built. He never visited the graves of the men who had died under his command. Perhaps it was too painful. Perhaps he simply wanted to be forgotten as thoroughly as he felt he had been. He died of influenza on the 23rd of March 1981, aged 96. He was buried in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission plot at Ben Mesik European Cemetery, Casablanca, far from the desert where he had won his greatest victory and far from the country he had served. A memorial plaque was placed in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral, alongside the memorials to Wellington and Nelson. It was a belated recognition that came too late for the man himself to appreciate. Let me give you the numbers one final time, though I should note that tank strength figures in the Desert War are notoriously difficult to pin down and vary by source. Auchinleck halted Rommel when the 8th Army's frontline tank strength had been reduced to perhaps 150 to 200 tanks against Rommel's remaining 50 to 70, at the end of a gruelling retreat, with an exhausted army and no fresh divisions. Montgomery attacked with approximately 1,000 tanks against 500, after 12 weeks of preparation, with complete air superiority, ultra-intelligence, and roughly 2-to-1 numerical advantage across most categories. Churchill's famous line, "Before Alamein we never had a victory, after Alamein we never had a defeat," erased first Alamein from national memory with surgical precision. The Alamein Churchill meant was Montgomery's second battle, the decisive Allied victory. But the battle that halted the Axis advance and saved Egypt, the one that made the second battle possible, was Auchinleck's. The historiographical debate continues, and reasonable historians still disagree about how much credit Auchinleck, Dorman Smith and Montgomery each deserve for Alam Halfa and El Alamein, but the revisionist case for Auchinleck has gained significant ground since Corelli Barnett first made it in 1960. The man who stopped Rommel at the gates of Cairo is no longer quite so forgotten. Auchinleck told the truth, kept silent, and trusted history. History has been arriving slowly, but it is arriving. If your father or grandfather served in the 8th Army, the Desert Rats, or any of the units that fought at First Alamein, I'd like to hear about it.